Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in linguistics. I'm Pramod Pandey, Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today we shall talk about rhythm, a topic that is related to stress. In the last module, we looked at the various aspects of tone and earlier of stress. Now we will move to the use of stress and tone at the sentence level. We will begin with the use of stress at the sentence level. Now, examples of sentence stress are on the screen. So there are hundreds of people in the field. I would like to invite you for dinner this Saturday. Notice that there are 8 words in the first sentence, but only 3 are stressed. And there are 9 words in the second sentence, and only 4 are stressed. Rhythm is the consequence of the organization of prominent and non-prominent syllables. Today, in this module, we will talk about how this organization plays an important role in the segmental realization of speech, not only in terms of the placement of stresses and the regularities, but also their effect on segmental realization. We will take up English for the discussion in general because English is a very well studied language. We have detailed in-depth descriptions of rhythm in English, but it should not be taken to mean that English is an ideal example of rhythm. It's an example of one kind of rhythm. In talking about it, most aspects of rhythm can be taken into account. But just as word stress patterns are different in different languages, sentence stress patterns are also different in different languages. Let's take a look at how sentence stress helps in the realization of rhythm. The study of rhythm is a top-down study. Another top-down study was syllable and the importance of syllable in the phonology of a language. Take a look at the 2 statements on the screen. We see that these statements could not be made without the notion of the syllable. Statement 1. In most languages, a larger number of phonemic segments occur at the onset position than at the coda position in a syllable. While there is no language that does not allow onsets, there are many languages that do not allow codas. Voiceless consonants in English are aspirated when they occur in stressed syllables. Now, these are typical statements which make use of the syllable. Without the notion of the syllable, these generalizations could not be made. That's the relevance of the top-down analysis. The units that are higher level units have an effect on the lower level units. As we said, in this module, we will take a look at the influence of sentence stress on segmental realization. Some examples to show that this is possible are given on the screen. We have 2 sentences on the screen. There are hundreds of people in the field. I would like to invite you for dinner this Saturday. The same sentences that were produced early on. Now notice that there are certain words which are not stressed in them, and as a result of which they are not fully pronounced. Words such as they, are, of, the, would, you, for, not, etc. These words are not stressed, and thus they are very weakly pronounced. And we will see how sentence stress affects the realization of segments in more than one way. Rhythm in poetry and in speech. A good way to start to understand the notion of rhythm is through something that we are familiar with, namely poetry. It is also something that goes deep into music. Music without rhythm does not make any sense at all. But poetry is something that most of us are familiar with. It's easier to understand. Now, when we look at a poetic line, what we find is that a poetic line is characterized in terms of a certain number of syllables and certain types of stress patterns. So there may be something like stressed, unstressed, like da 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 da. This is one kind of pattern, and the other is unstressed stress, da 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 da. What happens is that in poetry, poets normally select one or the other. The stress pattern da 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 da, that is stressed, unstressed, is known as a trochee, whereas the stress pattern da 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 is known as iamb. Now, poetic lines normally use one of them in the composition of a poem. Take a look at some two lines from two different poems. To swell the gourd and plumb the hazel shells. So, da 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 da. Beat the shining big sea water. Da 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 da. The first line exemplifies iambic meter, and the second line exemplifies trochaic meter. It is the regularity in the patterning of the stress unstressed syllables that characterizes poetic line. The difference between rhythm in poetry and rhythm in natural speech is that in natural speech we do not find stresses occurring with such regularity. Actually, if you look at various sentences, you will see that stresses are occurring at different places in different patterns. For example, look at the sentences on the screen. He is a professor of physics. So you have a stretch of he is a pro, all unstressed. Then you have a stress, and so on. My neighbor has an old car. This is very different from the first sentence. There are stresses on the last two words, there's a stress on the second word. The number of syllables are different, the stresses are different, and the pattern is quite unpredictable. That's the difference between rhythm in poetry and rhythm in natural language. Please note that I am not implying that poetic rhythm is all only regular. No, poetic rhythm can also be irregular. The only difference is that the irregularity in poetic rhythm is for a certain purpose. It has a certain meaning to convey. So when great poets like Milton and Shakespeare bring about an irregularity in the poetic line, you should be alert. Probably there is something very crucial and important to be expressed through the irregularity in the stress pattern. In natural speech, irregularity is expected. Types of speech rhythm. It is in the structural linguistic period in 1945 that K.L. Pike claimed that the rhythms in natural languages could be classified into two types, namely stress-timed and syllable-timed. The difference between the two types of speech rhythm is that in stress-timed languages, the stresses in a sentence occur at regular intervals, like. Whereas in syllable-timed languages, there is nothing like a regularity of patterning of stress. Rather, the syllables take their own time. Now, let's take a look at some examples. There are two sentences on the screen here. The man is here, the manager is here. Now, in native English, we are told that this timing of the two sentences is roughly the same. Moreover, the stretch from the first stress to the second one, the man is, in the first sentence, and from ma to here, manager is, 4 syllables, the stretches are of roughly equal duration. Now, when we look at sentences like this, we find that there is a fairly strong attestation of the claims of stress-timed rhythm characterization of English. However, it is not only the duration between the two stresses in two, let us say, comparable sentences that can be used as evidence for stress-time rhythm. We also need to find out whether the duration between the stresses is roughly equal. Now, on a close examination, it is found that the claim is not well attested. For example, in a very useful book on phonetics, Reeds and Youngman show that a sentence such as Eddie is playing a trombone, we have three stresses, but the duration between them is not equal. So essentially what you have is you have three different stretches starting from eddies and then playing a trom and then bone. So three different stretches. Now, according to the definition of stress time rhythm, those three stretches should be of equal duration, but that is not found to be so. The middle stretch, the second stretch from playing a trom, is almost double the duration of the first and the second groups. Now, the stress timed rhythm characterization of English is thus controversial. We need to go more into the notion of what a stress time rhythm is. Syllable time languages. They are so called because it is claimed that in syllable time languages, the number of syllables determines the duration of an utterance. In the first instance, it appears that the general claim is true. When we look at sentences in languages such as Bengali, Hindi, Tamil, what we find is that two sentences with different numbers of syllables in them do actually take different timings, different durations. We have two sentences from Hindi on the screen. Sentence 1, Vikas yahan hai. Sentence 2, Sudhakar yahan par hai. In the first sentence, we have 5 syllables and 3 stresses. In the second syllable, we have 7 syllables and 3 stresses. The first sentence takes 1.21 milliseconds in a particular utterance that has been recorded. And in the speech of the same speaker, the second sentence takes 1.76 milliseconds. The difference in the duration is proportionate to the difference of the number of syllables here. 5 syllables and 7 syllables, 1.21 milliseconds and 1.76 milliseconds is the difference is as predicted. However, when we take a look at the influence of stress in Hindi, what we find is that some of these processes that are found in English are also found in Hindi. For example, in Hindi, which is considered to be a syllable time language, in a word such as salana, which has been mentioned earlier, the middle syllable is stressed and the duration is more than the first syllable. Not only that, the first syllable has a reduced vowel in fast speech. So you can hear the syllable at least shorter in duration and often even with a reduced vowel, such as salana or salana, bimari or even bimari. Now, in this respect, Hindi shares some of the features of a stress language, stress time language such as English. Now, there is a third type of speech rhythm that also should be taken into account, and this is known as the Mora timed speech rhythm. An example of Mora timed speech rhythm is Japanese. Now, what is the notion of Mora? Mora is a unit of weight. We looked at the differences in syllabic weights, light syllable and heavy syllable. Something very similar to this also characterizes Mora. In Japanese, a short vowel has one Mora, a long vowel has two Mora, and a consonant after the vowel also has a Mora, but the onset has no Mora. Thus, the two words for Japan in Japanese, Nihon and Nippon, differ in two different Moraic weights. In Nihon, the syllables are like each Mora is like this. Ni has one Mora, and Ho is second Mora, N is the third Mora. So there are three Moras. And in Nippon, we have Ni, one Mora, P, two Mora, and O, that is Po, third Mora, N, fourth Mora. So we can easily, in the Mora-timed language, we can show the differences in the Moraic strength by sort of separating these. The orthographic system of Japanese is said to take into account the differences in the Moraic weight. Now, what is the evidence for the difference or distinction between these types of rhythm? Stress time rhythm, syllable time rhythm, Mora time rhythm. It seems as we go into the depth of investigation of analyzing the differences amongst these three types, it seems there is no very clear and strong evidence in support of the distinction. The general criticism against the distinction is of three types. Number one, whether these terms like stress timed and syllable timed and Mora time adequately distinguish the rhythms in these languages. Two, is the difference between these rhythm types, stress timed and syllable timed, absolute? And three, is duration the only phonetic cue in terms of which the differences in the speech rhythms can be accounted for? Now, coming to the first issue, namely the terms for the various types of speech rhythm. It seems that these are not the only terms. There have been others which have been proposed because the linguists have seen that the difference in the speech rhythms have some other account. For example, Lieberman in 1975 proposed the terms divisive and additive for stress timed and syllable timed rhythm, because according to him, the difference between the two rhythms is that in stress timed rhythm, it is the division of a sentence, of an utterance, in terms of the stresses that is important, and in syllable time languages, it is the stretches between the stresses, the stretches between the stresses that is important. So one is divisive, the other is additive. Another distinction that has been made for a stress time language such as English and a syllable time language such as French is something like leader timed language and trailer time languages. This difference is based on the differences in the patterning of stresses in the two languages. In English, the beginnings of words are important, and so it has leader timed stress rhythm, and in French, the ends of words are important, so it has trailer timed stress rhythm. The point is that syllable timed and stress timed are not the only terms that have been used to characterize the speech rhythms. Obviously, there are different aspects of rhythm which need to be taken into account. The second important issue is whether the distinction between stress time rhythm and syllable time rhythm is absolute. The answer is not really. Investigations of syllable time rhythm such as Tamil, Telugu have shown that these languages are not exactly syllable timed in the way in which syllable timed rhythm is understood. What we find is that there may be a mixture of the characteristics of the two languages. For example, look at the screen for data which show the similarity between English and Hindi. The processes which are found in English are also found in Hindi. For example, English has word final lengthening. There is no short vowel found at the end of words in English. The same is the case with Hindi. In colloquial, formal, standard Hindi, the short vowels are lengthened. And similarly, we have in English, unstressed syllables are reduced in vowel length. In Hindi too, we find evidence for the reduction of unstressed vowel length, as pointed out earlier. Let's take a look at the examples. In these examples, A has words from English and B has words from Hindi. A1 and B1 differences show vowel reduction processes, and A2 and B2 examples show final vowel lengthening in the two languages. Therefore, it appears that the distinction between stress-timed and syllable-timed speech rhythms is not absolute. The third issue is whether duration is the only cue that needs to be investigated in going into the nature of these two types of rhythm. And recent investigations show that that is not the case. There are other aspects of the phonetic characterization of rhythm that also need to be looked into. These aspects of the phonetic realization of rhythm could be amplitude and pitch change, among others. Now, although it is hard to find evidence for the absolute difference between stress time rhythm and syllable time rhythm, but it appears that there is some kind of basis to this distinction, found especially in cases of language transfer. Thus, when a speaker of French or of Hindi learns English, what we find is that some of the characteristics of English, which are based on the rhythmic organization of words, are not found in the learner's speech. So that the French English or Hindi English sounds very different. At least in these words, you do not find things such as vowel reduction so frequently. And there are other aspects of stress such as strong stress, extra breath force, which are also not found in the syllable time languages. Now, there are other phonetic features which are also not found in the second language varieties produced by speakers of French and Hindi, let's say. Having looked at the differences between the two types of speech rhythm and the controversial evidence in establishing the difference between the two types of rhythm, it appears that the validity for the distinction seems to lie on two accounts. Number one, perceptual differences are as important as articulatory differences. Most studies have focused on articulatory differences in the past, but as we conduct perceptual differences, we find that there is evidence for the difference in the two types of speech rhythm. Secondly, duration is not the only cue. There are other cues which have not been investigated in detail, such as amplitude, for example, which can be found to play an important role in the rhythm of syllable time language. We are now ready to look at the rhythmic structure of an utterance. First of all, each utterance has units called tone units. So it is the tone unit within which the rhythmic structure is described. Each tone unit has 4 parts to it: prehead, head, nucleus, and tail. As you notice, nucleus is the only part which is obligatory. Prehead, head, and tail are optional elements in a tone unit, which means that all those 3 can be present, or any one of them can be present. The structure is similar to the structure we found of syllable, where the nucleus of a syllable is obligatory, but onset and codas are optional in most languages. And then the final topic of this module, stress, clash, avoidance. The organization of stress and unstressed syllables in a language is, as we said, what gives us the rhythm of speech. What we find is that in some languages, there can be, especially in stress time languages, there can be a certain rhythmic pattern which is followed. For example, in English, the pattern like stressed, unstressed is the one which is preferred. Now, what happens when there are 2 adjacent stresses in 2 different words? In English, it so happens that this is considered to lead to clash. What exactly clash is, we will consider in the next course, because the definition needs to be, first of all, because the definition is based on certain technical terms which need to be first explained. It is sufficient for us to see that when 2 words have adjacent syllables stressed, then they lead to stress clash. In English, it so happens that when such is the case, the stress in the first word is moved away, goes to the other syllable. Thus, given a word such as 13, the stress is on teen, and when it is followed by men, we have 13 men. But in actual speech, in native English, we hear 13 men. Rather than 13 men, it is 13 men. Now, this is an example of stress, clash, avoidance. That is, a clash of 2 adjacent stresses in 2 adjacent words is avoided by moving the stress from one of the syllables to another syllable. In some languages, the clash avoidance can be simply by deleting or de-accenting stress. As in Spanish, for example, we are told that in Spanish, when this happens, then one of the stresses is de-accented. As for example, you see the word on the screen. The word for 10 children, 10 has a word which is stressed, and children has a word which is stressed, but when the 2 words are pronounced together, then the stress on 10 goes away. You have only 1 stress left on the word children. So clash avoidance can follow different processes in different languages. We need to look at languages from the perspective of how stresses organize and how the segments, because of them, get realized differently. Thank you.